Has the consecration of Russia been done? And if so, have we had the conversion of Russia and the period of peace yet? If you've looked into Fatima at all, then you've probably seen hundreds of articles and videos about this. So you may be asking, why make another one? Well, I was asked to comment on a theory, and in order to respond to it, I had to basically write an essay. And in the process, I actually learned some things. And if I didn't know these things, most of you probably didn't either. So since I already did the work, I figured I might as well turn it into a video. Which means, unlike my other videos, this is just going to be me reading off of a page. So if you'd rather just read the page yourself, the link is below. As I'm sure you're all aware, there is no definitive answer to this question. We're left in the realm of theory. I look at theory crafting as constructing a tree of branching possibilities. The relative likelihood of each individual fork along a given branch is scored based on how well it conforms to accepted source material, and the confidence level assigned to each source, and to one's own sensibilities of what is and isn't realistic in one's accumulated life experience, which obviously tends to be extremely subjective, and is usually the source of disagreement as to which theories are the most likely. And while some paths lead to more or less conclusive dead ends that can be ruled out as possibilities, the rest form the playing field of theories to pick from. Most people adopt a pet theory, myself included, but I also like to keep a vague mental map of where the forks are and why I evaluated them the way I did, so that as new information becomes available, it's easier to go back and adjust the scores accordingly. It's essentially Bayesian probability, but without doing actual math. So rather than simply present the explanation I consider most likely, I'd like to go through all the major possibilities regarding the various papal consecrations that have been made over the years, and consider their strengths and weaknesses. And the most logical way to do that is just chronologically. So, the first consecration of relevance to Fatima was performed by Pius XII on October 31st, 1942, broadcast over Portuguese radio. His audience was the thousands of pilgrims who had come to Fatima on October 13th, 1942 to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Miracle of the Sun. He renewed the consecration in St. Peter's Basilica on December 8th, 1942, with a slightly different text. And if you go on the Vatican's website, it looks like they have that version listed as the Italian translation of the Portuguese radio broadcast. They're clearly two different but similar speeches. Now, these consecrations were at least partially the result of a request from another visionary, Blessed Alexandrina Maria da Costa of Balazar, Portugal, a mystic and stigmatic that Lucy corresponded with several times. She claimed Jesus appeared to her on July 30th, 1935, requesting, "The same way I asked Margaret Mary for the devotion to my Sacred Heart, so now I ask you for the consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart of my Most Holy Mother, with a solemn feast in her honor," and warning her that a second world war would take place as a punishment for the sins of humanity unless the Holy Father made this consecration. And after it had begun, he told her that it would shorten the war. It's worth recalling that the consecration of Russia had also been intended to prevent World War II from happening, but I'll leave you to speculate on why our Lord would make two different but very similar requests to accomplish the same end. Adding to the potential confusion, Lucy was eventually prompted by our Lord to contribute another similar request with the same promise of shortening World War II, saying, "His Holiness will obtain an abbreviation of these days of tribulation if he takes heed of my wishes by promulgating the act of consecration of the whole world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, with a special mention of Russia." It's also worth pointing out that our Lord did not ask for the involvement of bishops in the consecration of the world. Lucy's original draft of her letter to Pius XII makes it clear that there were two distinct consecrations being asked for, and only the consecration of Russia required the involvement of bishops. The version of this letter that was actually sent to the Pope included changes mandated by the Bishop of Leiria, and in this edited version, the two consecrations are mixed up, and the involvement of bishops is not mentioned with regards to the consecration of Russia, but is instead requested as part of the consecration of the world. It looks to me like he was trying to intentionally conflate the two requests, maybe to make it seem less confusing for the Pope, or just less demanding. So, as you can see, this was a consecration of the Church and the world, not just the world. And throughout it, Pius XII invokes Our Lady by specific titles that Blessed Alexandrina had mentioned from her locutions: Queen of the Most Holy Rosary, Help of Christians, Refuge of the Human Race, Victor in all the great battles of God. So that may indicate that he had her request in mind. However, while he doesn't mention Russia by name, there is this one line here where he refers especially to a group separated by error who hold devotion to Our Lady in her venerable icon, hidden because of persecution. That would have been a very obvious reference to the people of Russia, who at that time had been under the persecution of Stalin's anti-religious campaign for the past decade. So that suggests that he also had Lucy's request in mind. Russia was not an object of the consecration, but our Lord only asked for a special mention of it, so you could argue that this satisfies that condition. Whatever the case, In a letter dated February 28, 1943 to the Bishop of Gurza, and another dated May 4, 1943 to Father Goncalves, Lucy confirmed that Pius XII's 1942 consecrations were incomplete, and, while our Lord would end World War II soon in response to them, the conversion of Russia, a promise attached only to the consecration of Russia, would not be granted, and future tribulations could be expected as a result. She reaffirmed this on December 15, 1951, in a letter to a friend. Our Lady's request concerning Russia has not been done. According to what X told me, the bishops of Russia sent a petition to the Holy Father asking for the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, such as Our Lady requested it. May God grant that this actually be true and that everything comes to pass, but it is a little late. Patience. These letters make it practically impossible to assert that the 1942 consecrations were the end of the matter, as they come to us through Frere Michel, citing Father Antonio Maria Martins, one of our primary and most reliable sources of Fatima information. Any theory that requires dismissing them as inauthentic loses a substantial amount of points, and I'm not aware of any serious Fatima scholars who hold this position. Some, however, have argued that the second request to Lucy represents a modification of the original request rather than an additional request with a new promise of ending World War II early. That is, the promise of the period of peace was transferred, in whole or in part, to the consecration of the world, and that the end of World War II was the beginning of that period. Given that one of the main goals of the consecration of Russia was to prevent World War II, the idea of connecting the war's end to the period of peace is compelling, and it is reasonable to suppose that the promise would be adjusted after it was too late to prevent the war. To judge the likelihood of this, we must first consider all the possible interpretations of the phrase, "a period of peace will be granted to the world." In the strictest sense, the promise can mean almost anything. On one extreme, since it was given in the context of the biggest conflicts in recorded history, it could simply mean the absence of a state of war between major nations or of multiple concurrent wars between a relatively large number of nations regardless of size. On the other extreme, given the scope of the Fatima events, i.e. a prophecy of multiple nations being annihilated, verified by a miracle whose sheer cosmic enormity is unmatched anywhere outside of the Bible, which was very publicly scheduled to the minute 3 months in advance and witnessed by tens of thousands of people for miles around, with many smaller miracles accompanying it, it is not out of bounds to expect that this peace would likewise be biblical in scale, bringing an epoch of prosperity to humankind and to the Catholic Church in a measure never before seen, perhaps even corresponding with the 1,000-year reign of Christ mentioned in Apocalypse 20. And in the middle, it could be a modestly long period with no wars, or at least no major ones, anywhere on Earth. No length is given, but World War I and World War II lasted 4 and 6 years respectively, so it is reasonable to expect that the peace would last at least as long. Additionally, when speaking of time frames in the context of war and peace, the implied perspective is historical, which is generally broken up by decades, generations, or centuries, so I would personally consider anything less than 10 years to be inadequate for consideration as a fulfillment of this promise. So what did we see in the 10 years following World War II? Several sizable conflicts involving almost every major nation, along with dozens of smaller ones, including Greece, Romania, Yugoslavia, Myanmar, Nairobi, Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, India, China, Paraguay, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Colombia, Costa Rica, and every nation involved in the creation of Israel, which I'm not even going to go through. And those are just the ones where communist forces were directly involved. There's almost 100 of them in total. I think that's sufficient to show that the only definition of peace this period could be considered to meet is the narrowest, the lack of a conflict comparable to either world war. So this is technically a viable interpretation, but the only support it has is that there hasn't been a World War III, and the absence of an uncommon occurrence within a relatively short span of time is pretty weak evidence. Additionally, an Italian work on the consecration of Italy to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, published in 1960, claimed that Our Lady appeared to Lucy again in May 1952, saying, "Make it known to the Holy Father that I still await the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart. Without this consecration, Russia cannot be converted, nor can the world have peace." If this is admitted into evidence, then the period of peace is clearly still tied to the conversion of Russia, and thus it could not have happened prior to this point, though this source is questionable. Alternatively, you could argue that the end of World War II represented a partial granting of the period of peace, but this is a purely academic point. The 1943 and 51 letters make clear that further chastisements of a military nature could be expected from Russia in the not-too-distant future, and that a proper consecration was still being awaited. Which brings us to Sacro Vergente Anno, Pius XII's apostolic letter addressed to the people of Russia on July 7, 1952, in which he consecrated the people of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Starting about 15 years ago, I began seeing an increasing number of theories proposing that this consecration was accepted. It is the first to mention Russia by name, and is unique in the form that it took, but the challenges it faces are many, The most obvious is that Lucy begged Jean-Paul II to do the consecration in her May 12, 1982 letter, implying that she didn't believe it had been done correctly. There's a copy of the original handwritten letter on the Vatican's website, though they conveniently cut this paragraph off. The rest of it I got from her diary, which is still an official source, so that makes the letter's authenticity a little hard to question, but perhaps not its veracity. The Imposter Lucy theory has also been gaining popularity, so you might disqualify this as having been written by a fake, though doing so means that the score of your consecration theory inherits the score of the compatible versions of the Imposter Lucy theory as a dependency. And yes, I am still making a video on that. I'm going to start recording it as soon as I finish recording this. But for now, that's out of scope. So for the sake of argument, we'll just ignore this. But that still leaves us with the glaring absence of any letters celebrating the completion of the consecration. If our Lord ever informed Lucy that it was done, then it's almost inconceivable that she wouldn't have mentioned it at least to her spiritual director and her bishop, both of whom have provided a record of their correspondence with her. You could draw some support from this letter she wrote to Pius XII in 1958. The fact that she believed communism would begin weakening in 1960, and that she makes no mention of the need for a consecration, both imply that the 1952 consecration was accepted. So that adds some points to the theory. An alternative explanation is that the 1952 consecration, like the 1942 consecrations before it, was generously rewarded even though it was incomplete, in this case by hastening the decline of the military forces of Eastern Communism, but that the conversion of Russia still required a consecration that actually met the requirements. The lack of any mention of the consecration could be the result of pressure from her superiors not to bother the Holy Father about the matter any further. In this New Year's letter to Father Aparicio in 1946, she talks about a priest that she had wanted to discuss the conversion of Russia with, but she couldn't do it because, quote, "Now more than ever I am under strict orders as regards correspondence and visits." And then later she says, "As for writing to the Holy Father, who am I? I am so aware of my incapacity and unworthiness that I only dare do it out of obedience." So she wasn't able to just write whatever she wanted to him. And in the 1958 letter she does say that she's writing because she was ordered to. So if she was told not to mention the consecration, then she wouldn't have. This is also well into the time frame where the Imposter Lucy theory comes into play, and there are several problems with this letter that I'll talk about in the next video. So you could posit that she'd been replaced by this point and dismiss the letter on those grounds. The consecration itself obviously had many flaws. To begin with, it's uncertain whether or not a letter can constitute a solemn act of reparation and consecration with regards to this request. You can't consecrate a building for use as a chapel by writing a letter to the parishioners saying that you consecrate the building, for example. That may not be analogous here because we don't know if the consecration is intended to have a sacramental function or not, but it seems like a reasonably close parallel. The lack of any direct participation by bishops is another major consideration. The apostolic letter obviously doesn't meet the literal requirements Lucy spelled out numerous times. And just to go through them quickly, there was her May 29, 1930 letter to Father Goncalves, her June 12, 1930 letter to Father Goncalves, her December 2, 1940 letter to Pius XII, the February 1946 interview with Father Young, and the July 15, 1946 interview with Catholic historian William Thomas Walsh. 4 out of 5 of these explicitly require that a command be given to the bishops, and all 5 of them say that the bishops have to do the same thing the Pope does at the same time. We can't get around this by supposing that Lucy didn't understand Our Lady's request because of something that she said in the Walsh interview. And I finally found the complete text of that interview while I was making this. It's linked in my report if you want to check out the whole thing, but I want to read you this one question because I think it's interesting. He asks her, "When you reported the words of the angel and of Our Lady, did you give the exact words as they were spoken or only the general sense?" And she answers, "The angel's words had an intense and overpowering quality, a supernatural reality that could not be forgotten. They seemed to engrave themselves exactly and indelibly upon the memory. It was different with the words of Our Lady. I could not be sure that every word was exact. It was rather the sense that came to me, and I put what I understood into words. It is not easy to explain this." So Our Lady communicated in pure meaning, not in words that required interpretation. So it's not a problem of understanding. Also, 2 of those letters were written less than a year after she received the request for the consecration, and Lucy reported having numerous apparitions and locutions during the subsequent years, in which Our Lady could easily have ordered her to correct any miscommunication. So suggesting that she forgot the details of what she was told, or that she failed to communicate them clearly, are not viable arguments either. You could technically get away with accusing Lucy of intentionally misrepresenting the requirements, but at that point we have no good reason to believe anything she said. But what we can do is propose that God loosened the requirements, just because we were having such a hard time doing it the way he asked. We can't go halfway with it and suggest that God accepted indirect participation from the bishops, because it's difficult to make a case that they did even that. It's not sufficient to claim that all of the Pope's magisterial acts are done in spiritual or doctrinal union with the bishops, because then it would have been completely superfluous and needlessly confusing for Our Lady to mention the bishops at all. I've heard it suggested that Pius XII's use of plural pronouns were a sign of his intent to speak for the bishops in a special way, but this is pretty obviously just an example of majestic plural, aka the royal we, which has been used by popes for centuries. The fact that they're capitalized is usually a dead giveaway. The cleaner argument then is to just say that God simply waived the requirement that bishops be involved entirely. That's really the only believable way to make this work. You could glean some support from this from a letter that Lucy wrote shortly after Sacro Virge Anno was issued. I also thank you for the magazine clipping which reports the consecration of Russia. I am pained that it still has not been done as Our Lady requested. Patience, let us hope that Our Lady will deign to accept it as a good mother. By suggesting at the end that it might be accepted anyway, it's evident that she had not received divine confirmation on the matter, and that she was open to the possibility of an imperfect consecration being effective. Though to me it seems more like an expression of polite optimism rather than a realistic hope. It is worth remembering that she expressed a similar hope for the 1942 consecrations in a May 2, 1945 letter to Father Aparicio, where she said it was necessary to really intensify the prayers and sacrifices for the conversion of Russia, to see if in spite of the fact that the consecration of that nation was not done in the terms laid down by Our Lady, we may achieve its return to God. If God did decide to accept the consecration without bishops, knowing in advance that this is how it was going to turn out, that would beg the question of why he would bother including them in the request at all. It only resulted in confusion and potentially scandal, as evinced by the fact that we're still sitting here in 2025 debating whether or not this consecration was accepted. You could take it as a lesson on God's mercy and leniency, but this doesn't seem like an appropriate place for such a banal lesson, especially without anything confirming that's actually what happened. Of all the branching theories that favor the acceptance of the 1952 consecration, this is the one I rate the highest, but it still strongly tests credulity. Also, it precludes belief in Our Lady of Akita, because on October 13, 1973, the 56th anniversary of the Miracle of the Sun, she said, "Fire will fall from the sky and will wipe out a great part of humanity, the good as well as the bad, sparing neither priests nor faithful. The survivors will find themselves so desolate that they will envy the dead." That is effectively the same thing as various nations will be annihilated. She didn't ask for the consecration to prevent it, but she arguably didn't need to, since the last known word from Lucy at the time was that it hadn't been done. Would God threaten a second such annihilation a mere 21 years after supposedly accepting the requested consecration, averting the original annihilation, and granting the world the promised period of peace? You could bring up Nineveh, but it was 100 years before God sent a new threat to them after they repented at the prophecy of Jonah, and 148 years before the second threat was carried out. Bringing back the exact same threat after just 20 years, and after that whole ordeal trying to get the consecration done to prevent it, would just be ridiculous. So those are the considerations regarding how closely the act conformed to the request. The other half of the equation we have to look at is the evidence suggesting that it was accepted. Did it produce a period of peace and the conversion of Russia? With regard to the period of peace, we are, as with the 1942 consecrations, left with nothing more than the absence of World War III and a nation-annihilating event. There's no particular evidence that such a thing was averted, but you can't disprove a negative, so that's a wash. If I really wanted to reach, I could dig up stuff like the 1961 Goldsboro B-52 crash, or the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident, or Able Archer 83, and claim those would have caused a nuclear war if not for the consecration, but I don't think any of that is good enough to be worth points. For the conversion, we have 70 years of political and cultural developments, culminating in Putin taking power and eventually adopting a Christian national political identity as a counter to the influence of Western propaganda and to promote a sense of national independence and pride, all of which shows no sign of being anything other than natural historical progression. Stalin did die in 1953, but that was a minor improvement. Khrushchev launched new religious persecutions spanning 1958 to 1964, and Brezhnev and Andropov resumed them from about 1970 to 1987. If I were being generous, I might give this a single point just for getting to something that is decidedly an improvement after 60 years, but a stopped watch is right twice a day. Pretty much every nation has undergone cultural and political transformation in the last 70 years, and on a long enough timescale, there's nothing surprising about the Russian government appealing to its cultural roots at some point after the inevitable implosion of their doomed economic model. I would also like to posit that the errors of Russia does not refer specifically to Marxism or Eastern militant communism. All of this really started with the Bolsheviks, who were the reason the Nazis gained power and the reason they invaded Poland, triggering the series of global wars that would become known as World War II. Remember, the October Revolution started about 3 weeks after the Miracle of the Sun, so they've always had a significant connection with Fatima. And I would further argue that the people financing the Bolsheviks were manipulating the United States and Europe into starting, or at least expanding, the war. I bring this up because those same Bolsheviks have continued to spread their influence to every nation on Earth, through the financial pressures of the IMF, the cultural influence of various programs such as USAID, and the social machinations of NGOs, provoking an endless series of wars, color revolutions, and localized persecutions to maintain geopolitical dominance. This has gone unabated to this day, with all of the Western governments pursuing more and more sinful and socialist policies, and constitutes compelling evidence that the chastisement is continuing to unfold exactly as Our Lady predicted in the Second Secret, bringing us ever closer to the annihilation event. Ironically, Russia is the only major nation right now that is not beholden to the errors of Russia, or it looks that way from an outside perspective at least, and that does constitute a type of conversion, but not a type of conversion that solves anything. There is no sign that we're heading for peace right now, nor have we ever been since the Cold War began. Another little side note, it may be worth considering whether or not the consecration was supposed to prevent Vatican II. As we all know, the Third Secret, according to many who've read it, speaks of the crisis of faith in the hierarchy in the same breath as the wars and annihilation of nations in the Second Secret. In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc. Do the period of peace and the conversion of Russia include somehow remedying this situation? Our Lady did say, if what I say to you is done, many souls will be saved and there will be peace. That could just refer to the salvation of people who died suddenly without the sacraments as a result of World War II, or to those saved through the First Saturday devotion, but on the other hand, it would be odd for Vatican II to be the only disaster Our Lady foretold at Fatima for which she offered no solution. Even if John XXIII had cancelled his plans for a council or released the secret, the infiltration of the organization was well underway by then and would almost certainly have continued progressing, if a little slower. Unless the secret calls for something like an inquisition to purge the ranks of the clergy. Anyway, just something to think about. One attempt at rationalizing the lack of any apparent divine intervention after this consecration that has been put forward is that, because it was done imperfectly, God punished us by diminishing the fulfillment of the promises to the point of rendering it indistinguishable from the background noise of normal history. But rather than frame it as a partial fulfillment, as we discussed with the 1942 consecrations, it is asserted that the matter is concluded, that because we put forward a consecration that wasn't good enough to merit the originally implied effects, we were given the absolute minimum necessary for the promise to be considered fulfilled, and are permanently locked out of attempting another consecration to gain the rest. Let me start by saying that any argument that begins with the words God would not, unless it's citing dogma, is almost always a flimsy one rooted in one's own personal sensibilities. I'm about to make such an argument, I just wanted to acknowledge it first. So first of all, that would defeat the entire point of the thing. There's a statement our Lord made that a lot of people forget or don't consider the implications of. This is from one of Lucy's letters in 1936. Intimately, I have spoken to our Lord about the subject, and not too long ago I asked him why he would not convert Russia without the Holy Father making that consecration. Because I want my whole church to acknowledge that consecration as a triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, so that it may extend its cult later on, and put the devotion to this Immaculate Heart beside the devotion to my Sacred Heart. In other words, the reason our Lord chose a consecration as the means by which he would grant the promises was that he wanted the consecration to be acknowledged as a triumph of the Immaculate Heart, which would increase devotion to it. In order for the whole church to see it as a triumph, not just a handful of Fatima enthusiasts watching videos like this, it would have to produce noticeable effects that could be tied to it causally, which means they'd either have to occur very soon after it, or be logically related to it in an obvious and objective way. Lucy repeated this notion in an interview in 1982. Russia is an immense, well-defined territory, and its conversion will be much remarked, thereby demonstrating what can be obtained through consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This is likely why our Lord required the participation of all the bishops. Organizing all 5,000 plus of them to perform the same prayer on the same day would be a sizable undertaking, and would be much more likely to attract the attention of the average Catholic than something the Pope did by himself. Reducing the effect of the consecration to the point that we couldn't tell whether or not anything happened at all would defeat the whole point of it. Now, you could try to characterize this as the generous designs of God being thwarted by the sins of mankind. There is precedence for that concept in the Fatima story. The children were told to return to the cova every 13th of the month, but when they failed to attend on August 13th because the chief magistrate of Orem held them prisoner at his house, they were subsequently told, if they had not taken you to the town, the miracle would have been greater. Yes, the miracle of the sun was originally supposed to be more impressive. It's questionable whether or not you could justly apply that to the 1942 or 52 consecrations, because Pius XII, through no fault of his own, didn't know that the bishops needed to be involved. At least according to Irene Poznov, who was involved in sending the request for the consecration to Pius XII on behalf of the Russian people, and who exchanged letters with Lucy. You could perhaps blame the Bishop of Fatima or Father Goncalves for editing Lucy's letter to Pius XII, and otherwise failing to communicate the requirements. You could certainly blame later popes for their flawed consecrations. But there are two key differences between the miracle of the sun getting diminished and this proposal. Firstly, Our Lady informed us of this change almost immediately, 6 days later, months before the miracle. That was completely unnecessary in this case because, secondly, she never provided any specifics about the miracle in the first place, other than the date, so the prophecy was not altered and thus there was no risk of scandal. I can't think of any case where God decided to alter the deal, so to speak, without telling us. The wording of the promises was extremely vague, yes, but even with that much room for interpretation, almost nobody has looked at the period of the last 70 years and recognized it as their fulfillment. Usually the point of a divine punishment is to teach us a lesson, to leave us completely ignorant of what happened, when all that would have been needed to clear it up was a word from Lucy or another credible prophet, is something I can find no precedent for. There was nothing forcing God to accept this imperfect consecration, nor to respond to it in the proposed manner. I can think of 4 alternatives that all would have made more sense. He could have, 1, refused to accept it and either waited for an acceptable one or let the punishment play out as prophesied. This finds precedent in that literally every conditional prophecy in the Bible, and in all of Catholic tradition as far as I know, that outlines a detailed punishment ends with the punishment being carried out, with the exception of Nineveh in the book of Jonah, which was spared because the people fulfilled the condition, but the punishment was still carried out a century and a half later when they fell back into their old ways. Option 2, he could have partially accepted it or at least rewarded it, and produced some effect related to the promise, its complete fulfillment pending an acceptable consecration, and informed us of this situation, as was done with the 1942 consecrations. Option 3, he could have accepted it and generously fulfilled the promise as originally intended despite its imperfections. This has no real precedent because it's precluded by the ubiquity of option 1, but you could argue that the apparitions of Our Lady of Guadalupe fit the same spirit. It wasn't presented as properly conditional, but St. Juan Diego was told to return to Our Lady the next day so that she could give him a sign to convince the bishop that he was telling the truth. He failed to return in order to take care of his sick uncle, and the next day he actively tried to avoid her while he was on his way to get a priest to give his uncle the last rites. But despite this, she not only still provided the miraculous sign, but went even further and cured his uncle on the spot. It is at least an example of a lack of faith on the part of her instruments not getting in the way of her designs or abundant generosity. Or option 4, he could have accepted it and fulfilled the promise in a limited way that nevertheless still accomplished his stated goal, i.e. of having the whole church acknowledge the consecration as a triumph of the Immaculate Heart, and informed us that he did so. This would only require some form of miraculous event immediately following the 1952 consecration to bring it to the attention of the church and connect it with the Fatima prophecy. For example, repeating the miracle of the sun over the city of Rome for thousands to see, or some dramatic but limited political event in Russia. The conversion of Russia in the period of peace could still have unfolded slowly over the succeeding decades if that was desirable for some reason. Why would God decide to scuttle his stated intention as a form of lesser punishment for our lack of faith and failure to comply, rather than addressing it in any of these other well-established manners? Even assuming he did, if God knew that he was going to end up fulfilling the promises in such an invisible way, then why bother telling us that the reason a consecration was chosen as the condition was that he wanted the church to acknowledge it as a triumph, adding needlessly to the expectation that it would produce something obvious enough to be widely acknowledged? Why publicize the promises in the second secret at all, rather than confining them to the letters between Lucy and the Holy Father, which could have been kept private in order to minimize scandal and confusion, and to avoid decades of the faithful wasting their efforts and prayers trying to get the consecration done when it was no longer relevant? While such an assertion can't be decisively refuted, there is likewise no good reason to believe God would do this, much less is there evidence suggesting he did it in this particular case, especially when a much stronger argument can be made in favor of other explanations, including other consecrations on this list. Are we really supposed to believe that an event whose mere sign, the thing intended to make us take it seriously, was the biggest celestial miracle since at least the Old Testament, would conclude in a way so vague and hidden that we're still trying to figure out what happened, if anything? that God would send his mother, with attendant miracles literally springing up from her very footsteps, to promise to convert a nation by means of a prayer, and then do it through completely non-miraculous means over the course of 60 years, because the prayer accidentally ate its way into the Goldilocks zone of not being bad enough to reject, but not good enough to reward as originally implied, and then not even bother conveying that outcome to the world after decades of locutions leading up to it. That a period of peace just means the absence of the biggest conflict ever known. That this is worthy of being called a triumph for the Immaculate Heart. I just don't buy it, and I think anyone who does is kidding themselves. While I'm ranting, the other cop-out that some people raise to explain the overt failure of this consecration, and those that follow, to produce the promised effects, is that we haven't performed enough communions of reparation yet. This is what the kids today refer to as copium. First of all, strictly speaking, Lucy never said that the promises required some specific number of First Saturdays. In fact, she said the opposite. In her May 29th and June 12th letters in 1930, she wrote, "If I am not mistaken, the good Lord promises to put an end to the persecution in Russia if the Holy Father himself deigns to make a solemn and public act of reparation and consecration of Russia to the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, as well as ordering all the bishops of the Catholic world to do the same. And if the Holy Father promises that, upon the end of this persecution, he will approve and recommend the practice of the reparatory devotion of the 5 First Saturdays already described." Ending the persecution in Russia sounds a lot like converting Russia, or at least the beginning of converting it. So in other words, the promise could have been fulfilled, or at least partially fulfilled in a very public and obvious way, before the 5 First Saturday devotion was even publicized, so effectively nobody had done it yet. Lucy consistently emphasized that the important thing was for the Pope to promulgate the devotion. The only time she ever tied the actual practice of the devotion to one of the promises was in 2 letters to Father Aparicio in 1939, where she said it would prevent the war. And even there, she only said it had to be put into practice, emphasizing the need to spread the devotion rather than the need to reach some critical mass of communions. But if you want to turn this into a numbers game, let's do some real math. You know I love sneaking math into these videos, right? So, consider the estimated Catholic world population when Our Lady asked for the 5 First Saturday devotion, which was December 10th, 1925, was roughly 300 million. It is possible to make the 5 First Saturdays 2.4 times per year. If every single Catholic on Earth performed it every month without fail from January 1926 until the start of World War II in September 1939, that would have been 9 billion communions of reparation. Recall that the consecration was originally supposed to prevent the war, so this is the maximum number that could have been required to meet the theoretical quota. But it's a ridiculous maximum because that was obviously not the expectation. The promise of saving grace at the hour of death only requires a person to perform it once in their lifetime, so let's assume that God wanted every Catholic on Earth at the time to perform it once, giving us a very slightly less ridiculous quota of 300 million. There are 1.4 billion Catholics in the world today, so even if 0 communions of reparation had been performed up to this point, 10.7% of Catholics performing it twice each could meet the required number within a single year. In the last 85 years, we'll start from 1940 since it wasn't made public until September 13th, 1939, there have been 204 periods of 5 months. In that time, 1.4 million Catholics performing the devotion continuously, which is 0.49% of Catholics at the time and 0.1% today, or 3.5 million performing it once a year, which was 1.18% then and 0.25% now, would reach the goal. Do you seriously think that the number of Catholics who have been practicing this regularly is less than 1/7 of the population of New Jersey? I consider the 1952 theory to be the lowest ranking of the popular interpretations. The kindest thing I can say is that it clears the bar of feasibility if you squint at the text hard enough. This is the sort of thing that people come up with when they're trying to repair a defective prophecy. We've become accustomed to entertaining creative interpretations in religion because we've been doing it forever with the Bible, to try to make sense of what appear to be contradictions. But I don't think contemporary prophecy should be given that sort of leeway. God tells us what's going to happen ahead of time so that our faith is strengthened when it does. If the only way to make a prophecy work is with absurd post hoc rationalizations like interpreting, for example, at the moment of the miracle Joey will have new eyes and he will see permanently after that, as meaning that he's going to die over a decade before the alleged miracle happens, then what was the point? Fatima isn't as clear-cut because most of its prophecies were conditional, but the same principle applies. God does not scandalize his children needlessly. There are some very specific times when he uses extraordinary supernatural events in a way that tests our faith temporarily, but outside of that, there's no reason that an omniscient being couldn't frame a prophecy in a way that, at bare minimum, didn't require several forms of mental gymnastics in order to be considered accurate. Okay, rant over. On to Paul VI. On November 21st, 1961, he proclaimed Mary Mother of the Church and commemorated Pius XII's consecration of the world. Most people don't even remember this one. Technically, it's not a consecration. He merely recalls the previous one and then commends the human race to the Immaculate Heart. It did not involve any bishops, and nobody seriously thinks this was the one. So, moving on to John Paul II. On June 7th, 1981, he made an act of entrustment of the human race to the, quote, Mother of Men. He was still recovering after having been shot on May 7th, so rather than doing it in person, a recording was broadcast over the radio. This was also not a consecration, but it was the first effort in what would become a series of nearly identical consecrations, all with a vague reference to Russia. Even in this one, you can see there's a line, those whose entrustment you also await in a special way. The next one was a year later, May 13th, 1982, performed at Fatima. While he says his intent is to repeat what Pius XII did, this is notably different. Grammatically speaking, the recipient of the consecration is the Mother of Men and Peoples, though the Immaculate Heart is at least mentioned. No significant number of bishops actively participated, but he explicitly notes his intent to offer it united collegially with them, and had asked them to join him spiritually, which was a first. I would consider Pius XII's venerable icon phrase to be a far more explicit reference to Russia than those men and nations who particularly need this entrustment and this consecration, but in this case it is mentioned as a special object of the consecration rather than just getting special mention in the speech, so that's at least something you can say for it. On May 14, 1982, Lucy specified in an interview that the request was for the consecration of Russia and solely of Russia without any addition. The source on this is not beyond doubt, and all kinds of bizarre statements started to be attributed to her in the 80s, but it's worth mentioning. The next one was October 16, 1983, during the 6th General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops. At the end of the Mass, and before the Angelus, he consecrated the world using an abridged version of the 1982 prayer. He opened first by saying, "At that time I asked my brothers in the episcopate to be with me spiritually. Today many of you, thanks to the Synod of Bishops, are here, and in your presence and in union with you, I wish to repeat what I said on May 13, 1982. The vast majority of bishops were probably in attendance, though in his closing homily on October 29th, he documented a handful who were absent, specifically the representatives from Lithuania, Latvia, and Laos, and one of them from Czechoslovakia. This was almost certainly the largest number of bishops physically present for any of the attempted consecrations, though not all those attending the synod were necessarily present at this particular Mass. One could potentially argue that some of the more reprobate bishops, though present and asked to participate, did not join their will to the act either out of laziness or disdain for the Fatima apparitions, but I would consider this a weak argument, as the only way to avoid that with certainty would be to declare that any bishop who failed to participate interiorly would be defrocked automatically, and thus would no longer count toward the denominator of bishops. Lucy never even began to suggest the need for anything that drastic or meticulous. She did, however, say that the request was for the Pope to order them to participate, and John Paul II only asked them nicely, which could be considered a meaningful defect. She also said, in the May 29th and June 12, 1930 letters, and in a meeting with the Papal Nuncio of Portugal on March 21, 1982, that the consecration needed to be a solemn and public act. A synod is a private gathering of bishops. This Mass would not have been open to the public and was most likely not broadcast live very widely, if at all, so that could be considered another significant flaw with this one. It would seem that the Pope was not satisfied with these consecrations because less than 2 months later, on December 8, 1983, he wrote to the bishops of the world to inform them that a ceremony was to take place in Rome on March 25, 1984, and to ask them to renew the consecration with him on that day. When that day came, during a speech to the faithful in St. Peter's Square before the Mass for the Jubilee of Families, he expressed his intent to be united with the bishops of the world spiritually in the consecration, though not literally. During the Mass itself, he recited another abridged version of the 1982 prayer, but with some changed wording and one notable addition. It already had the line, "In a special way we entrust and consecrate to you those men and nations who particularly need this entrustment and this consecration," but he added another line that said, "Enlighten especially the peoples whose consecration and our entrustment you await." Lucy's alleged to have said initially that this was not accepted, then a year later started saying it was, but her statements at this point are so questionable I don't think they're worth factoring in. As far as I know, nobody counted how many bishops were in the audience in St. Peter's Square, but there are no obvious ones visible in any of the photographs I've found of the event. That one line he added is slightly less ambiguous than what was already there, because there's only one nation she's awaiting the consecration of, but I think it's still less overt than Pius XII's reference. It's also not an object of the consecration, he's just asking her to enlighten them. If we believe the reports that John Paul wanted to mention Russia but was dissuaded by fear of political repercussions, then we might object that such a faithless act could not have hoped to call down heaven's reward, but the earlier cited example of Our Lady of Guadalupe leaves open the possibility. Whether or not these prayers conform more closely to Our Lady's request than previous attempts depends on how much weight you give to each individual element. If you think that the Immaculate Heart being the clear grammatical subject of the consecration is very important to God, then they will rank lower. But if you think God doesn't care as long as it's directed at the Virgin Mary and her Immaculate Heart is mentioned somewhere, then you might rank it higher because of the greater number of bishops directly involved. It is strange, however, that so many people, including the Vatican and allegedly Lucy herself, decided that the 1984 consecration was the one that was finally accepted. Other than the phrase noted above, it's functionally identical to the 1982 one, and the only advantage it has over the 1942 ones was that the bishops were at least asked to participate and the prayers were explicitly offered in spiritual communion with the whole episcopate. The 1983 one would seem like the obvious winner among the trio given the physical presence of most of the bishops. Whichever one you might favor, they were followed by the death of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev in November 1982, Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and eventually Putin's shift to an overt Christian identity around 2010. Some people include the Severomorsk disaster 4 days after the 1984 consecration, but it did not significantly weaken the Soviet Union or contribute to its fall, and the notion that it averted some kind of military action that they had planned is baseless speculation. I don't believe it can be said that there was a religious conversion among the people. While they may have publicly recited the party line and avoided any outward sign of belief during the preceding decades, the persecution did not actually remove the Orthodox faith from the hearts of the people. This political conversion of Russia, while not what Lucy had personally envisioned, unfolded relatively quickly after these consecrations and constitutes the single most compelling piece of material evidence in favor of any of them. The resulting change to the state of world peace is more debatable. The end of the Cold War certainly brought peace of mind to a number of nations that had lived in fear of nuclear Armageddon, though the instability of the former Soviet bloc introduced the danger of nuclear weapons or their precursors falling into the hands of terrorists. The number of armed conflicts in the world remained fairly stable until a rising trend started in 2012. In terms of the total number of deaths, it depends on what you count as armed conflict and whether or not you include the impact of disease and famine, but there was definitely a sharp drop in 1989. The toll remained relatively low throughout the 90s, with the notable exception of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, and small spikes for the Bosnian War in 1992 and the Kosovo War and Second Congo War in 1998. Despite the war on terror, the casualty rate remained low throughout the 2000s, until a major increase beginning in 2012 that continued until the present conflict in Ukraine, which returned us to the 1980s range. By most metrics, that stretch of 23 years from 1989 to 2012 was the most peaceful period we've had since World War II. The correlation here is compelling, and while our Lord all but explicitly stated that a consecration of the world with special mention of Russia without the bishops would not bring about the long-awaited conversion, one made with the bishops was not discussed. And while it's definitely not what was requested, it's not entirely unreasonable to suppose that God mercifully decided to consider it good enough. Much as I hate to admit it, it's a valid theory. Personally, I still don't think the result was impressive enough to justify the miracles at Fatima that heralded it, nor to produce the effect of it widely being acknowledged as Our Lady's triumph, and the errors of Russia never stopped weaving themselves deeper into the fabric of global order and culture. I could see these events as a partial fulfillment of the promise, or an unrelated reward granted in response to the consecrations, similar to the 1942 ones. But if the 90s was the world's long-awaited period of peace, then I want my money back. The next consecration was done by Francis. After asking the Bishop of Fatima to consecrate his pontificate to Our Lady of Fatima, which he did in union with all of the bishops of Portugal on May 13, 2013, Pope Francis announced that he intended to consecrate the world to the Immaculate Heart without the bishops on October 13, 2013. Instead, he asked the, quote, Blessed Virgin of Fatima, with no mention of the Immaculate Heart, to accept with the benevolence of a mother this act of entrustment that we make in faith today before this your image, beloved to us. He not only failed to name what he was entrusting, he didn't even specify who he was entrusting it to, stating only that the act was being made before this your image. So that was another non-consecration. But he did a notably better job on March 25, 2022, 1 month after the start of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. There he consecrated the Church, the future of humanity, our needs and expectations, the anxieties and hopes of the world, and the whole human race, especially Russia and Ukraine, to the Immaculate Heart. Like John Paul II, he invited the bishops of the world to join him, and several did. A few even live-streamed themselves doing it, but almost certainly not as many as participated in the 1983 consecration. The prayer is a step up from the one used in the 80s because the Immaculate Heart is the clear subject and Russia is explicitly named as one of the objects, though it's one among many instead of the only one or even the only special mention. In the 3 years since then, the conflict has escalated continuously, with several nations contributing finances, arms, mercenary troops, training, and intel to both sides. There's not much more to say about this one, other than that I was sincerely disappointed at the number of people who actually thought this consecration had any chance of being the one. And that brings us to the final theory, which is that it hasn't been done yet. None of the theories concerning this prophecy are especially convincing, but I consider this one the most likely. All of the consecrations so far have deviated significantly from the request, and none have produced an impressively miraculous result, so simply claiming that it has not yet been done avoids all of the problems on both of those fronts. The only difficulty this theory faces is a looming deadline. The idea that our Lord's allusion to the King of France at Tuy and Rianho was meant to indicate a time limit of about 100 years has never been especially well founded, but it is enough to feasibly claim that the chastisement is still unfolding and the prophecy is still in effect. Current events continue to line up in a way that could very well give us a leveled European city and a dead bishop in white in that time frame. You might object that our Lord hasn't sent us any further messages or signs indicating that he's still awaiting the consecration, but by the same token, he also hasn't sent us anything to confirm that it's been done. This may seem discourteous, but keep in mind that the 3 kings of France that ruled during the century our Lord was awaiting their consecration do not appear to have gotten any reminders or status updates either. In fact, we don't even know for sure if the French throne was informed of our Lord's request to begin with. St. Margaret Mary died a year after conveying the request to her superior, and even if Louis XIV was told, was it passed on to Louis XV or Louis XVI? And yet we're told in the Fatima material itself that the punishments came anyway 100 years later because the request was not fulfilled, so it's reasonable to suppose that Fatima will follow a similar model or progression. On a side note, Jesus told Lucy that the King of France eventually made this consecration, but I can't find any record of that. At the very least, I can't find any version of a French coat of arms or flag or royal banner that has the Sacred Heart on it, which was part of the request. Maybe a quiet consecration ceremony was held between the start of the revolution and the king's execution 4 years later, and history just failed to record it amidst the chaos. If sometime shortly after June 13th, 2029, we see a chastisement that comports with what we know of the Third Secret, or at least one directed at the clergy, since the allusion to the King of France's punishment was directed at them, that would make a solid case that prior consecrations were not adequate, and that we can expect a valid one at some point in the hopefully not too distant future. My personal cutoff date is January 1st, 2036, since the major chastisements of the French Revolution, including the king's execution, were well underway within 106 years, and Napoleon was just beginning his rise to power. After that point, if nothing significant has happened, then the likelihood of this theory drops precipitously. And while I was recording this video, Leo XIV was elected. We're pretty much at the deadline now, so assuming he doesn't get killed in the next couple of years, he is very likely to live long enough to be the bishop in white who gets executed. Will he be the one to do the consecration? Who knows? May Our Lady guide and shelter us through the coming decade.